The buzz of clippers filled the air, blending with a low hum of conversation and laughter. The neighborhood barbershop was more than just a place to get a fresh cut. It was a meeting spot, a place where stories were told, where jokes flew back and forth, where the scent of aftershave and warm shaving cream carried a sense of familiarity. At the center of the room sat Marcus, a big guy with a quiet presence, his deep brown eyes scanning the shop as he waited for his turn in the chair. He was built like a brick wall, broad shoulders stretching the seams of his hoodie, hands resting calmly on his lap. His dark skin glistened under the shop lights, and while some might assume he was just another regular customer, there was something about him, something controlled, calculated. Marcus had been coming to this barbershop for years. It was his spot, a place where he could relax, get cleaned up, and have a good chat. He didn't talk much, but when he did, people listened. Despite his size, he carried himself with ease, never trying to dominate a room, never seeking attention. But that night, attention found him. The door swung open hard, the bell above it jangling against the glass. A group of 3 men strode in, their energy shifting the entire mood of the shop. The laughter died down. Conversations faded. Even the barber holding the clippers paused for a second before continuing. Marcus didn't have to turn around to know trouble had walked in. He felt it. The tension, the unspoken challenge in the air. The tallest of the 3, a wiry guy with a cocky smirk and a tattoo creeping up his neck, let out a laugh as he scanned the room. His eyes landed on Marcus, sizing him up in an instant. "Man, what we got here." He muttered loud enough for everyone to hear. His 2 friends chuckled, one of them, a shorter guy with a gold chain swinging from his neck, leaning against the counter as he eyed Marcus. "You taking up the whole seat, big man," the first guy continued, stepping closer. "What you weigh? 350, 400. A few guys in the shop shifted uncomfortably. No one wanted trouble, but they also knew the type. These weren't just random guys looking for a cut. They were looking for something else, looking to start something. Marcus didn't react. He just blinked, slow and steady, like he hadn't even heard them. The barber working on the chair next to him shot him a glance, a silent question in his eyes. "You good?" Marcus gave the slightest nod. He was good. But the tall guy didn't like being ignored. His smirk faded, replaced with something meaner. "Hey, I'm talking to you, big man," he said, taking another step closer. "What, you deaf?" Still, Marcus didn't move. His breathing stayed the same, steady, controlled. The shorter guy chuckled again, glancing at his friend. "Yo, maybe he's scared." That got a few nervous laughs from their third friend, a guy built like a pit bull with arms crossed over his chest. But no one else in the shop found it funny. The barber in front of Marcus, an older man with salt and pepper hair, finally spoke up. "Look, fellas, we don't need no trouble here. If you want a cut, sit down. If not, take it outside." The tall guy clicked his tongue, shaking his head. "Nah, see, I don't like when people disrespect me," he said, locking eyes with Marcus now. "And you sitting there acting like I don't exist, like I ain't right here in front of you. That's disrespect." For the first time, Marcus moved. Slowly he exhaled, his shoulders rising and falling. Then he turned his head, looking up at the guy standing over him. His voice when he spoke was calm, low, unbothered. "I don't know you," Marcus said simply. The shop went dead silent. Even the clippers stopped. The tall guy tilted his head, a flicker of something uncertain crossing his face before he shook it off. "Yeah, well, you bout to." His hands flexed at his sides, knuckles cracking. The pit bull-looking guy shifted his stance, like he was getting ready for something. Marcus just watched, studied. He could see it plain as day. These guys were used to people folding, used to getting in people's heads, making them flinch. But Marcus wasn't most people. What they didn't know, what no one in this shop knew, was that Marcus wasn't just some big guy. He wasn't just another customer in a hoodie, waiting for his turn. Marcus had spent years in the ring. 12 years of training, 5 as a pro, heavyweight class, precision, power, patience. He knew how to read a person, how to see an attack before it even started. He knew how to hit, and more importantly, when to hit. And right now, he knew these guys had no idea what they were getting into. A slow smile tugged at the corner of Marcus's lips. Just a little, just enough. The tall guy saw it and sneered. "Something funny," he snapped. Marcus leaned back in his chair, stretching his arms slightly before resting them again. "Nah," he said, his voice smooth. "Just thinking." "'Bout what?" Marcus let the question hang in the air for a moment before answering. "How bad you 'bout to embarrass yourself?" The gang leader's face twitched, caught between anger and confusion. And then, the air changed. The moment before the storm. The barbershop, once filled with the familiar sounds of clippers and conversation, was now locked in a silence thick enough to cut. And in that silence, Marcus knew. It was about to go down. The tension in the shop was thick. No one moved. No one spoke. It was one of those moments where even the air felt heavier, where everyone in the room knew something was about to happen, but no one wanted to be the first to make a move. Marcus could feel the stares. He could feel the way the barber behind him had taken a slight step back, as if already preparing for what was coming. Even the guy in the chair next to him had stopped mid-laugh, frozen with the uncomfortable realization that this was no longer just casual shop banter. The tall guy's nostrils flared as he took another step closer. His friends stayed behind him, but they were just as locked in, waiting for the first sign, the first excuse to turn words into action. He was close now, too close, standing over Marcus in a way that made it clear he wanted to provoke something, force some kind of reaction. Marcus didn't move, didn't blink. His face was calm, but his mind was already 10 steps ahead. He could see how this would play out, could read it the way a seasoned player reads the board before making a move. The guy standing in front of him was all ego, all pride, the kind of man who had spent his life using intimidation to get what he wanted. He had probably never been challenged, never been forced to second-guess himself. That's why Marcus's calmness was making him angrier. "Yo," the guy snapped. "You think you tough, huh?" Marcus exhaled slowly, then finally spoke. "I think you need to take a step back." The words weren't loud, but they carried weight. They weren't a request. They weren't a threat. They were just a fact. The shop went even quieter, if that was even possible. The tall guy let out a short laugh, shaking his head. "Oh, you one of them quiet types, huh? Thinking you above all this?" His hand twitched, fingers flexing at his side. Marcus saw it. He always watched the hands. People's words could lie, but the hands told the truth. And the truth was, this guy wanted to swing. He was trying to decide if he should. Marcus didn't move. He didn't tense up, didn't shift in his seat. He just kept his eyes locked on the guy's face. His patience was limitless, but he knew patience wasn't the same as weakness. If this guy made the mistake of putting his hands on him, Marcus would handle it, but not yet. The pitbull-looking guy behind him leaned in, a grin on his face. "Man, he ain't gon' do nothin'. Just sitting there acting like a statue." The tall guy smirked. "Yeah, maybe he froze up." Marcus could feel the heat in the room now. The energy had shifted, and not in a good way. The barbers, the customers, everyone was tense, waiting, hoping it would blow over. But Marcus knew better. This wasn't the kind of thing that just faded. The tall guy took one more step, now standing so close that Marcus could feel his breath. That was a mistake, a big one. Marcus's fingers twitched, but he kept them still. Not yet. The guy's voice dropped lower, just above a whisper. "Say something now, tough guy." Marcus looked up at him. He could see it now, how this guy was searching for fear in his eyes, for hesitation, but he wouldn't find it. Instead, Marcus smiled, not wide, just a small, knowing smile. The tall guy's jaw tightened. He wasn't used to this. He was used to people backing down, avoiding eye contact, making excuses. But Marcus wasn't built like that. He had spent years in the ring, facing down opponents with real skill, real power. And this guy, he wasn't one of them. The door to the shop suddenly swung open again, breaking the moment. A young kid, no older than 10, rushed in, his mom trailing behind him. They were just here for a haircut, oblivious to the tension in the room. The barbershop owner, an older man with tired eyes, took the opportunity. All right, he said, stepping forward and raising his hands slightly. That's enough of this. We don't do this here. If you want to talk tough, take it outside. The tall guy didn't move right away. He was still looking at Marcus, still waiting for something, some sign that he had won this little standoff. Marcus held his gaze, then finally said, "Step back." His voice was different this time. Not loud, not angry, but firm. The tall guy hesitated for half a second. Then, with a smirk, he stepped back, lifting his hands in mock surrender. "Aight, big man, I see you." He turned, laughing as he walked back toward his friends. The energy in the shop started shifting again, just a little, but Marcus knew this wasn't over, not even close. The gang wasn't leaving. They weren't done. They were just waiting. And Marcus knew, deep in his gut, that before the night was over, this was going to come to a head. He just didn't know when. The gang didn't leave right away. They lingered near the door, talking in low voices, every now and then throwing glances in Marcus's direction. The barbershop's usual warmth had turned cold, the easygoing conversations now replaced with cautious silence. The other customers were pretending not to notice, but everyone felt it, the weight of what just happened and the sense that it wasn't finished. Marcus stayed in his seat, calm as ever, but he could feel the shift too. He had seen guys like this before. They weren't just looking to start trouble. They were looking for validation, for control. And when they didn't get the reaction they expected, it messed with them. That's what was happening now. The tall guy, his friends, they weren't used to being dismissed, weren't used to someone like Marcus refusing to play their game. The barber in front of Marcus, a man named Rico, wiped his clippers and let out a breath. "Man, they need to take that nonsense somewhere else," he muttered under his breath, shaking his head. Marcus didn't answer, just gave a slow nod. He wasn't worried. He had been in situations far worse than this, but he also wasn't naive. The way those guys were acting, this wasn't going to be one of those things where they just let it go. The tall guy, still grinning like he had won something, took one last look around before nodding to his boys. "We'll be around," he said casually, his eyes flicking back to Marcus for a second. Then they left, the door swinging shut behind them. The tension in the shop loosened, but it didn't disappear. Everyone was still on edge, still processing what just went down. A few of the guys exchanged glances. One of them, an older man sitting in the corner, let out a dry chuckle. "Boy, they don't even know," he murmured, shaking his head. Rico smirked. "Man, if they had any idea." Marcus just sat there, rolling his shoulders slightly. He could feel a familiar itch, the energy he always felt before a fight. His body knew before his mind did. This wasn't over. He didn't want trouble. He never did. But he also wasn't about to let someone walk all over him. Not here, not anywhere. His turn finally came, and Rico started lining him up. But even as the clippers buzzed against his skin, Marcus's mind wasn't on the haircut. He was thinking about what came next. ####. Outside, the night was settling in. The air was cool, the street lights humming with a dull glow. Marcus stepped out of the shop, pulling his hoodie over his head as he made his way down the block. He wasn't looking for anything, wasn't expecting anything, but he also wasn't the type to be caught off guard. As he turned the corner, he caught a glimpse of movement in the alley up ahead. Marcus didn't react, didn't slow down. He just kept walking, his hands in his pockets, his mind already preparing. A low voice cut through the quiet. "Yo, big man." Marcus stopped, turning his head slightly. The tall guy stepped out of the alley, his grin still there, but this time there was something different in his eyes, something sharper. Behind him, the pit bull-looking guy, and the one with the gold chain stepped out as well. Marcus exhaled slowly, already knowing where this was going. The tall guy took a step forward, tapping his knuckles against his palm. "See, earlier, you tried to play me," he said, his voice lower now, all the fake amusement gone. "And I don't like that." Marcus didn't answer right away. He looked at them, really looked at them. The way they were standing, the way their hands moved, the way their weight shifted. He had spent years in the ring, learning how to read an opponent before they even threw a punch. And these guys, they weren't ready. Marcus tilted his head slightly. "I didn't play you," he said calmly. "You walked in there looking for something. You just didn't find it." The guy's jaw tensed, his fingers twitching at his sides. The pit bull-looking guy scoffed. "Man, you talk too much." The tall guy's smile returned, but it was thinner now, stretched tight. "Yeah, you do," he muttered, "and you bout to regret that." Marcus didn't move. His breathing stayed the same. His pulse stayed the same. The only thing that changed was the way his stance shifted ever so slightly, weight balanced, ready. He didn't start fights, but he damn sure knew how to finish them. And he had a feeling this one was coming sooner than they thought. Marcus stood there, silent, watching them like a man who had seen this play out too many times before. The night air was cool against his skin, but the energy in the alley was charged, humming like a live wire. The tall guy shifted his weight from foot to foot, his fingers still flexing, still trying to convince himself that this was his moment. The guy with the gold chain cracked his knuckles. "What cat got your tongue now?" he taunted, stepping up next to the leader. "All that sitting still in the shop, now you quiet out here too." Marcus didn't bite. He knew how this worked. He had fought in rings under bright lights, with crowds screaming his name. He had faced men who spent years training, men who actually knew how to move, how to strike, how to read the rhythm of a fight. These guys, they weren't fighters. They were just used to people being scared of them. The tall guy laughed under his breath, shaking his head. "Yeah, he ain't got nothing to say now." But Marcus was watching their feet, watching the way the tall guy's stance was unsteady, how his hands clenched and unclenched too fast, like he was trying to hike himself up for something he wasn't ready for. The pit bull-looking guy was different, quieter, his eyes locked onto Marcus with something closer to calculation. He wasn't just here to play backup. He was waiting. Marcus shifted his stance just a little, so slight they probably didn't even notice. He could feel it now, the way the air had thickened, the way the space between them was closing inch by inch. Then it happened. The tall guy moved first, just like Marcus knew he would. A sudden lunge, wild and uncoordinated, a fist swinging too wide, too desperate. Marcus had already stepped to the side before it even got close. The motion was smooth, effortless. The tall guy's fist cut through nothing but air, and in the half-second where his balance wavered, Marcus could have ended it right there. But he didn't. Not yet. The guy with the gold chain cursed under his breath. "Man, what the?" The pit bull-looking guy moved next. Fast, faster than his friend. A sharp step forward, shoulders dropping low like he was going for a body shot. This one had some training. Maybe not boxing, but something. His form was tighter, his feet better placed. He actually knew how to throw a punch. Marcus barely had to shift to avoid it. He felt the air move past his ribs as he twisted slightly, his reflexes kicking in before his mind even needed to process it. They were getting frustrated now. Marcus could see it in their faces, the way their confidence was cracking. They had walked in here thinking they were about to teach some big guy a lesson, make an example out of him. But now they were realizing that they had no idea what they were up against. The tall guy recovered and turned, anger flashing in his eyes. "Aight, that's how it is," he growled, straightening his stance. "Think you slick." Marcus exhaled through his nose, keeping his hands loose at his sides. His body was ready, but his mind was calm. "I gave you a chance to walk away," he said, voice low. "You should have taken it. But only set them off more. Gold chain guy moved in, swinging fast but sloppy. Marcus didn't even step back this time. He just angled his shoulder slightly, letting the fist slide past him like water off a rock. The pitbull-looking guy took his shot next, aiming for Marcus's ribs, but it was the same result. Empty space where Marcus had just been, nothing but misstemmed aggression. Marcus wasn't even trying yet. And that's what scared them the most. The tall guy's face twisted with frustration. His confidence, his control, it was slipping through his fingers like sand. He had probably never been in a real fight before, never had someone stand in front of him and make him look foolish without even breaking a sweat. His temper flared, and this time, he didn't just swing. He lunged, throwing all his weight forward, trying to tackle Marcus outright. That was his biggest mistake yet. Marcus shifted his weight, stepping aside with precision. The tall guy stumbled past him, his momentum working against him, and in that split second, just a fraction of a second, Marcus could have ended it. One clean shot, one well-placed counter. But he didn't. Instead, he let the tall guy catch himself, let him turn around, breath ragged, frustration clear in every muscle of his face. Because Marcus wanted him to understand. Wanted all of them to understand. This wasn't their fight to win. This wasn't their story to control. And the moment they realized that, that's when everything would change. The tall guy stood there, breathing hard, fists clenched so tight his knuckles looked pale under the streetlight. Marcus could see it. He was unraveling, trying to force himself to believe he still had control with this situation. But deep down he knew. They all knew. The others weren't moving as much now. Gold Chain had stopped talking, his confidence cracked. Pitbull-looking guy was watching Marcus carefully, his stance shifting like he was second-guessing himself. The whole energy had changed. It wasn't just about intimidation anymore. It wasn't just about proving something. It was about survival now. Then, out of nowhere, Marcus heard it. A slow clap. It came from further down the alley, just beyond the glow of the streetlight. A shadowy figure leaned against the brick wall, watching the whole thing unfold like it was some kind of show. Marcus hadn't seen him before, hadn't even noticed him. But the way he carried himself, the way his voice cut through the night, it was different. The gang turned, their expressions shifting from anger to something closer to uncertainty. They knew him. The man stepped forward, his face coming into view. He wasn't as big as Marcus, but he had presence. A quiet, controlled presence. He was older than the others, maybe late 30s, early 40s. His build was lean, compact, the kind that spoke of experience rather than brute strength. He had sharp eyes, the kind that had seen more than most people would in a lifetime. "I was wondering when you'd finally swing," the man said, his voice smooth, almost amused. He looked at the tall guy first, then at Marcus. "But now I see what's going on here." Marcus didn't say anything. He just watched. The tall guy shifted uncomfortably. "Yo, we had this handled," he muttered, but his voice lacked the conviction it had earlier. The man raised an eyebrow. "Yeah, that's what this looks like." Silence. Then the man turned his attention back to Marcus, taking his time as he studied him. There was something different in his gaze, something more calculated than the others. He wasn't just looking at Marcus, he was reading him. "You're not just some big dude who lifts weights," the man said finally. "You move too smooth for that. Too calm." Marcus didn't react. He didn't need to. The man smirked slightly. "Yeah, I know what you are." A beat passed. The air in the alley felt heavier. Then the man nodded slowly, as if he had just figured something out. "You're a fighter," he said. This time Marcus spoke. His voice was low, steady. "Used to be." The man chuckled, shaking his head. "Nah, you don't used to be that. It stays with you." He glanced back at the others. "That's why y'all are swinging at air like amateurs." Gold Chain frowned. "Man, what's that supposed to mean?" The man ignored him. He kept his focus on Marcus. "What weight class?" Marcus hesitated, just for a second. "Heavyweight." The man exhaled through his nose, like he wasn't surprised. Figures. He took another step closer. Not aggressively, but deliberately. I've seen guys like you before. Cool heads. Don't waste movement. Know exactly when to strike. He glanced at the tall guy. That's why you ain't even had to touch him, and he already looks like he lost. The tall guy tensed, but didn't say anything. Marcus stayed still. He didn't know this man, but something about him was different from the others. He wasn't reckless. He wasn't just running his mouth. He was feeling things out, the same way Marcus had been doing from the start. Then the man's expression shifted just slightly. Not a threat, not a warning, just something colder. So, tell me, the man said, voice lower now. If I step in, do I get the same treatment they did? Silence. Marcus could feel the shift again. This was different. The others had been kids playing at something they didn't understand. But this man knew what he was doing. He wasn't asking for a fight. He was measuring one. The tension in the alley grew thicker, almost suffocating. The sound of the night, distant traffic, the faint hum of a radio somewhere, seemed muffled now, as if the world was holding its breath, waiting for something to snap. Marcus felt it, the shift in the air, the way the others were no longer the immediate threat. The man, the one who had stepped out of the shadows, watched him closely. He wasn't waiting for Marcus to make the first move. He was waiting for something else. Some signal. You want to see if he's still got it, don't you? The man said, his voice low and controlled. You miss this, don't you? The fight, the rush. Marcus didn't answer, but his fists clenched instinctively at the words. This wasn't about intimidation anymore. This wasn't about some street gang trying to make a name for themselves. This was a test, and Marcus could feel it. This man, whoever he was, wanted to see how far Marcus would go. He wanted to see if the years of boxing had left any fire in him, or if it had all faded into nothing. The tall guy was still breathing heavily, clearly frustrated, but he wasn't as bold anymore. He kept his eyes on the man in the alley. Gold Chain and Pitbull Guy exchanged glances but didn't move. They didn't understand what was happening. The man stepped forward, breaking the silence that hung between them like a wall. I'm not here to fight you, big man, he said, his voice almost gentle now. I'm here to see if you're still worth the trouble. Marcus narrowed his eyes. He'd been in enough fights to recognize when someone wasn't just running their mouth. This guy wasn't here for a scrap. He was here for something bigger. The man gestured to the others, who were shifting nervously. These kids don't get it. They don't know the first thing about real fighting. They think they can intimidate, that they can push people around because they got numbers. But you're different. You know what it's like to be in control, to be calm when everyone else is losing their heads. There was a long pause. The wind rustled, and the only sound that broke the stillness was the distant echo of car tires on wet pavement. You want to know why I know that? The man's eyes flicked to Marcus. Because I was you, once, and I'm still trying to find out if I ever left that part of me behind. Marcus was silent. The man leaned in a little, his gaze steady. I've been watching you, for a while. You think you're done. You think you can walk away from all that blood and sweat and pain. But the truth is, it never leaves you. You can't just turn it off. Marcus felt his pulse quicken, but he didn't show it. This wasn't the moment to react. Not yet. You're good, the man said, his voice quieter now, more to himself than anyone else. You've got talent, but you've been hiding from it, and that's what I came to tell you. Before Marcus could respond, a shout broke the tension. Yo, what the hell is this? The tall guy's voice rang out, his fists clenched again. We came here for him, not some damn therapy session. The man ignored him, still focused on Marcus. He took a step back, letting the gang simmer, their impatience and confusion growing. I was you, the man repeated, but I never left the fight. And now I'm here, watching you turn your back on it. I don't know if I can respect that. Marcus's chest tightened. This was it. This was the moment, the test, the final push. But just as Marcus was about to speak, just as he was about to say something to end this, something changed. A loud thud echoed in the alley. Everyone froze. Out of the corner of his eye, Marcus saw movement. It was quick, too quick, and then the world seemed to shift. A car door slammed open from the street. A figure stepped out, tall, shadowed by the streetlights. And then, the gunshot rang out. Time seemed to slow. The tall guy stumbled back, eyes wide in shock. His hand flew to his chest, blood dripping between his fingers, his mouth open in disbelief. Gold Chain and Pitbull Guy froze, their faces drained of color. The man who had been talking to Marcus didn't flinch. He didn't move. He simply turned, his expression unreadable. "Get out of here," he said flatly, his voice cold now. The gang didn't hesitate. They didn't even look at Marcus as they bolted for the street, disappearing into the night as quickly as they had appeared. The alley was silent again, save for the distant screech of tires. Marcus's heart was pounding in his chest, but his mind was racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The man who had been testing him wasn't just here to provoke a fight. He was here for something else entirely. He was here to drag Marcus back into a world he had been trying to escape for years. And now, with the sudden gunshot, everything had shifted again. Marcus hadn't seen who fired. The mystery of it still hung in the air, unresolved. But he could feel it, deep in his gut. This was far from over. The alley fell into an eerie silence after the gunshot, the air thick with tension and the metallic scent of blood that quickly soaked into the asphalt. Marcus could feel his heartbeat in his throat, a pounding reminder that the night had just taken an unexpected turn. The gang was gone, scattering into the night, their footsteps echoing like a distant nightmare. But it wasn't over, not yet. Marcus looked down at the tall guy, who was now on the ground, his hand pressed against his wound, the blood staining his clothes. He didn't seem to understand what had just happened. His wide, panicked eyes flickered around as though searching for someone to explain, but there was no one left. The streetlights seemed to flicker in sympathy, casting long shadows over the scene. The man who had been watching, who had tested Marcus, was still standing there, calm as ever. He wasn't bothered by the chaos. In fact, he seemed almost detached, as if he had expected this to happen. The shot had come from somewhere down the alley, just out of Marcus's sight, but the man didn't flinch. He didn't react at all. Marcus took a cautious step toward him, his gaze never leaving the man. There was something about him that felt dangerous, like he was a part of a world Marcus had tried to leave behind long ago. A world where the stakes were high, and survival was the only rule. "You knew that was coming," Marcus said, his voice steady despite the whirlwind of thoughts in his head. The man nodded slowly, his eyes still fixed on the empty alleyway ahead. "I've seen this before," he said, his voice low, almost too calm. "I knew you'd get tested. I knew they wouldn't let it go." He looked at Marcus then, his expression unreadable. "They don't understand. They never do." "Who was that?" Marcus asked, trying to make sense of what had just happened. "Who fired the shot?" The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked down at the wounded tall guy, then back at Marcus. "Does it matter?" he asked cryptically. Marcus hesitated, then shook his head. "I guess not." For a moment, the two of them just stood there, the weight of the situation hanging in the air. The street light buzzed faintly overhead, casting long shadows over the alley, but there was nothing in those shadows that could make this go away. No one was coming to help, and no one was coming to explain the situation. "You could have stepped in sooner," Marcus said after a long silence. "You could have stopped all this from going down." The man finally turned to face him, his eyes narrowing slightly. "I wasn't here to stop anything," he said, his tone flat. "I was here to see what you'd do, to see if you still had it in you, to see if you could handle what was coming." Marcus's brow furrowed in confusion. Handle what? The man's gaze softened just a touch. "The world doesn't stop spinning just because you're tired of fighting, and sometimes you don't get to walk away." It hit Marcus like a punch to the gut. He had been running from his past for so long, trying to escape the world of boxing, the violence, the weight of everything he had left behind. He had tried to find peace, to live a life without the constant tension, the threat of danger lurking just around the corner. But it wasn't that easy, was it? There was a long pause. Then the man spoke again, his voice lower this time, almost like he was speaking more to himself than to Marcus. "You're not done yet. You may think you are, but you're not. You can walk away, sure, but the world's not going to stop and wait for you to catch up." Marcus swallowed hard. He wanted to argue, wanted to tell the man that he was wrong, that he had made peace with everything. But deep down, he knew the truth. This wasn't just about the fight. It never had been. It was about him, about what he had left behind and what he had yet to face. The man took a deep breath, then turned his attention back to the tall guy, who was now lying motionless on the ground. "He won't make it," the man said, "but it doesn't matter. He was never going to make it." Marcus frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" The man shrugged. "Some people aren't meant to survive. They don't have what it takes." He paused, letting that hang in the air for a moment. "And some people don't want to. They just don't realize it until it's too late." Marcus didn't know how to respond. He was still processing everything that had just happened. The gang, the gunshot, the man who had come out of nowhere. He was trying to make sense of the words, but they didn't fit into the neat little box he had built for himself. Life didn't work like this. "Are you gonna help him?" Marcus asked, nodding toward the tall guy. The man's eyes flickered down briefly, and for a moment, Marcus thought he might actually show some sign of concern. But instead, he simply shook his head. "I'm not here to save anyone, Marcus. Not anymore. That's not what this is about." Marcus felt a twinge of anger stir in his chest. "So what is this about then? What do you want from me?" The man looked at him for a long moment, as if weighing his words carefully. "I'm not asking you to save anyone. I'm asking you to save yourself. The world's not going to give you a second chance, Marcus, and neither am I." The words hit harder than any punch he had ever taken, but Marcus wasn't sure if they were true. He wasn't sure of anything anymore. "You're not the same guy I remember," the man added, a touch of sadness creeping into his voice. "But maybe you can be. I'm not here to drag you back into the ring, but I'm not going to let you waste what you've got left either." Marcus stood there, the weight of the man's words pressing down on him, making him feel smaller than he had in a long time. He looked at the tall guy again, still lying motionless on the ground, and something inside him shifted. The past wasn't just a place to run from. It was a part of him, and no matter how far he went, it would always catch up to him. The man turned to leave, his footsteps echoing in the silence. "Think about it," he said over his shoulder. "I'll be around." Marcus watched him go, feeling the pull of something inside him. He didn't know what it was, but he felt it, stronger now than before. He wasn't sure if he was ready to face it, ready to step back into the world he had left behind. But he knew one thing: it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. As the man disappeared into the night, Marcus looked down at the ground, his fists still clenched, the remnants of the fight still lingering in his veins. He wasn't sure what the future held. He wasn't sure where he was going. But for the first time in a long while, he felt alive. And that, he realized, was enough.